Over the last few years, psychology has enjoyed the status of a science. However, I would like to point out a few things about psychology that are at least suspicious and, at worst, very damning. But first, let's start with a simple question. What is psychology? If you ask Google or an average professor, they will likely tell you something like, psychology is the scientific study of mind and behavior. And yes, insofar as things stay within these parameters, psychology is a legitimate objective science. There is, however, a subcategory of psychology, which is called psychopathology, which is the area of the field that is mostly dealt with by clinical psychologists and psychiatrists. Psychopathology can simply be defined as the study of mental illness. And this is where things get tricky, because even giving an appropriate definition of mental illness is extremely difficult, if not impossible. The Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, or DSM, defines mental illness in the following way. A mental disorder is a syndrome characterized by a clinically significant disturbance in an individual's cognition, emotion regulation, or behavior that reflects a dysfunction in the psychological, biological, or developmental process underlying mental functioning. At first, this seems quite plausible. I mean, we all kind of have an idea of what a disturbance or a dysfunction is, but that's exactly the problem. This is where psychopathology becomes political. Because you see, in order to justify calling something a disturbance, it is not enough to show that the mental functioning of someone is abnormal. Being very resilient to pain is quite abnormal, in that most people are way less resilient than you. But we would not call this a disturbance, because we find it socially acceptable to be resilient. Another example would be that of being very tall. Sure, being very tall may be abnormal, but it is not considered a disturbance. For something to be a disturbance, it must have some kind of negative connotation to it. Or at least it must cause dysfunction. But really, what is a dysfunction? Technically, for something like a machine, a dysfunction would be a property that prevents it from doing what it is supposed to do. A dysfunctional dishwasher, for example, is a dishwasher that cannot wash dishes well. But what is the function of a human being exactly? What is a human being supposed to do? Is there anything that a human being is de facto supposed to do? Or is there no particular purpose to the whole thing? Whether there is an answer to this question is quite irrelevant when it comes to the objectivity of psychopathology. A better question would be, is there any way that the use of science can tell us what a human being is supposed to do? If you ask people this question, they will often say yes. However, I contend that this is because most of them misunderstand the question. For instance, one might say that by examining mental states, we can tell which kinds of states cause pleasure and which cause suffering. But that still does not answer the question of what a human being is supposed to do. The fact that a mental state is pleasurable does not in any way imply that it ought to be preferred. The first supposition is merely a factual claim, whereas the second is a moral claim. Just because we associate pleasure with goodness does not mean in any way that we are justified in doing so. This is known as the is-ought problem by David Hume. Some other people, especially biologists, will say that humans have the same underlying motivation as other animals, namely survival and reproductive success. Fine, let us assume that a human being's function is survival and reproductive success. Does this mean that the conditions like antisocial personality disorder, anxiety disorder, depression, etc., are only pathological insofar as they harm a person's survival and reproductive success? That seems like a very odd thing to say, and a very problematic thing to say. Odd, because we are not used to thinking in this sort of way. And problematic because it implies that pathology is wholly relative. If antisocial personality disorder is a mental illness only because it inhibits a person's survival and reproductive success, then if we manufactured a society where behaviors which arise from this disorder were naturally selected, then it would cease to be a pathology. It would cease to be a disorder. To call something an illness, it must at the very least cause harm to the person having it, no matter what society he belongs to. But as we saw above, many mental illnesses are wholly dependent on the kinds of behavior that are naturally selected. In other words, they do not cause harm unless they exist within a particular societal context. So, if the context changes, then they no longer cause harm. Therefore, although mental illnesses are in fact real, they cannot be labeled as illnesses. An infection causes harm no matter what the social context is. A fever causes harm no matter what the social context is. But any behavior of any kind cannot be said to do the same. If mental conditions cannot be said to be illnesses, then what can they be said to be? Well, they can be described as deviations from the norm of human cognition and behavior. And why would we label these deviations as pathologies? Well, perhaps because it is convenient for our current political state. You see, a person who is narcissistic or psychopathic is quite a big danger to the political state that is founded upon principles like justice and human rights. A psychopath acts with no regard for the interests of others, or for the conventions of the society he is in, and that is why we want to cast him out. We want to put him in a different category from us, in a category that fundamentally separates him. We want to call him mentally ill because we simply do not like the idea of a society that would consist of people who are psychopathic. And in this sense, the label psychopath or antisocial personality disorder is merely a political device that helps us clean out certain people from the pool of natural selection. It is our way of saying, these bad people, these weird people, these whatever people are not like us, and we want to put them in a different place. We don't want them to be considered the same as us, because we, of course, are not like them. This is why psychology is always political, and why it can never be a socially independent science.